Okay, still getting the hang of this stupid media player. Welcome to Evolution Hour. We are clickety-clacketing our way to a new episode. Okie doke. And how that looked, I don't know. And then let me also put up our patrons. So all may see. Thank you very, very much. It is much easier to get by squeaky, squeaky, squeaky every month with all of you helping. Thank you so much. Okay. Well, anyway, amazingly enough, or maybe not so amazingly enough, because Nathaniel Jeanson's book is much sparser on source citations, we've hit the last of his main chapters and the last of his appendices. And so it turns out that the only possible place, the only possible place that we could still have any sources running amok is in the section that he dumped way at the end of the book, which are the credit information on his various charts and photographs that he used. So he's got a heck of a lot of stuff to pile in. And I'm going to be very interested to see whether or not he ends up actually citing everything that's in the reference or not. Anyway, if I get that out of the way by next week, that will conclude the world of Jeanson, and we'll be able to get on to that Wackaloon Dinosaur book that I got earlier. Framing this book, why not review your own? Well, I can toot my own horn, but I'd much rather have people read it and proceed accordingly. Anyway, so Appendix B in Jeanson is on the Y chromosome Adam and Eve stuff. And basically, it's just a glut of his prior assertions. He finally drags in a few more of his own creationist sources that he hadn't cited earlier. And takes a jab at, quote, mainstream scientific views, unquote, that disallow, quote, new non-mainstream views, unquote, indulging in a gobsmacking hit and run. Oh, hi, Vesta. Oh, I'm having internet issues. Am I having internet issues or are you having internet issues? Jeanson says members of the mainstream scientific community are aware of this. They view it as a fatal weakness of the opposition. They've also codified this position into U.S. federal court decisions, unquote. Hi, Brian. Well, Jeanson cited a 2017 Douglas and Kirkpatrick evolution book for the first sentence, and the 1982 McLean v. Arkansas Board of Education decision on the second, which is a pretty glib piece of source dropping, as he didn't list any pages in the textbook where the authors were supposedly saying this. Creationism and materialism are not arising as index topics. I happen to have a copy of the book. It's a standard thing on evolutionary material, and it's not really dealing with the topics where they would be gloating or otherwise going, you creationists can't get over this hurdle. As for the court decision, I explore that one and the other cases in tip 1.6 on my website, so I'm going to be putting a little link into that. I encourage everybody to share widely any of the PDFs that I compiled on that stuff. In future, some of that stuff will be incorporated into later books, like the Coulter Camp book on how creationists have tried to take over the educational system, as well as the courts and the government and a few other little things besides. But anyway, and particularly what bothered me about that whole period of creationist litigation is Justice Scalia and his absolutely astonishingly peculiar dissent on Edwards v. Aguilar, which that is a ruling that is not alluded to in Jeanson's little myopia. All it mainly involves is how the courts, apart from Scalia, were not terribly impressed by the attempts by creation science to paint itself as science. Scalia didn't seem to get that memo. Anyway, The rest of the short appendix is Jeanson citing his own stuff, and including his tendentious prediction that the Y chromosome tree misses about 60% of the human population growth curve, which is only because the analytical tools, which I mentioned in an earlier show, the analytical tools that appreciate the chromosome data actually cannot differentiate really, really recent things like the last 1,500 years or so. So all of that recent population rise is functionally invisible. So it was a matter of him just simply bypassing it all. That previously large might take a long time to go through. Yes, yeah, I'm afraid so. It's an awful lot of stuff. I mean, the reference bibliography in our book is practically, if you printed it out at the same scale that Jeanson did, is as big as Jenson's book. So, and his reference bibliography, as I pointed out, is relatively sparse. It's not a huge amount of sources. Anyway, Appendix C that follows Appendix B is even shorter. It's basically, can I find my ancestors with genetic testing? And he had no references at all in that. So absolutely nothing. So the next episode then will be hopefully tidying all of that up, where I'll be trying to find out whether or not he actually alludes to the remaining references in his reference bibliography as the documentation for his various charts that he covers over things. I'll be going over Heim and insect royalty. Yeah, that whole bit about how queens develop in insects, in both ants and wasps and queens, and not all of those species are in fact formatted that way. You still have some examples of where you have normal male and females, and you don't have the all hive structure where everything is female children that way. But that's because there's a gigantic number of wasps, ants, and bees to bother, tens of thousands of species. So there's a huge amount of lineages going on in there. Anyway, the part 2 is a little post from Ken Ham, which is therefore why I have the joke about ham and eggs. Anybody that watches Paulogia's videos will love that little tune he has on there, ham and eggs, flip them, flop them, deppa, deppa, because it's a pun on AiG sounding like egg if you read it that way. Well, Ken Ham was weighing in on some brand new cosmology papers that are dealing with measuring the very earliest stars in the universe and all of these kinds of things. And so there's the new James Webb Space Telescope has put up observations of very early stars, and it got a repost by AiG in June that I think is worth a comment. So here he had this February post that gets repeated in June of this year, gloating about these papers and their evolutionary dogmas and all of that. And only 2 of the wasp kind were in the ark, right? Actually, as far as I can tell, creationists don't think about that. There's relatively little analysis on what insects have as baraminology anyway, and don't expect anything to be filled in on that. But by and large, creationists don't think there were any bugs on the ark, even though some critters like anteaters would kind of need to eat ants, wouldn't they? Because they're totally adapted to them. So, you know, they don't bother too much about that. Pesky little fiddly bit details. So there'll be a lot of that little sidebar of what gets left out of AiG's baraminology gloss when we have the appendix in volume 2 of the Roxford there, going into the nitty gritty of the ark encounter. Anyway, so there were this posting that Ken Ham is riffing off of that is basically a posting from O'Callaghan on Quantum Magazine. Technical papers had not appeared in February. There was just the early press announcements of these findings. Well, February to June is quite a few bits. You wonder whether or not the scientists were starting to prepare papers for these topics. Turns out they did. So even though from AiG's point of view, the world was stuck in February, it turns out that O'Callaghan himself had put up a follow-up posting more recently, I think it was like in April, referring to the new work and providing links to the new papers or discussions of the new papers. And all three of them are up at, well, two of them are up at archive.org, and another one is up. One of them actually has been published at Nature. I think it's a preprint still, but it's up on their website. And I'll be putting the links into the archive ones on the Maiolino and Vanzella papers, and then one to the Nature link for Jeanson 2023. So what is all this upshot? The tendency of creationists is to hit and run. And so they will scavenge through the current technical literature to find little bliplets of things to go, ha ha, naturalistic assumptions, or they fail to see the creator, or they fail to see these critters died during the flood, etc., 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 the usual mantras. And then once that's under the rug with the posting, boop, it's off their scope. I've noticed this in plowing through years and years of Acts and Facts and the Journal of Creation and others, that there's just an amazing amount of this phenomenon going on. Then you will get the reprise bit where they'll kind of glom on to the reference to the earlier bit, but not do any follow-up. So what it'll, hi Purple, what it'll mean that dung beetles had plenty of. Yeah. What that means is that we'll be watching to see whether or not Ham or any of the other creationists knocking around there, who are Jason Lyle and all the rest, who actually are, well, let's call them astrophysicists in quotes. Once in a while, they'll even do some actual technical papers in the regular journals, not pushing their young Earth creationism, but they still do some technical material. It's relatively peripheral, but what can I say? But for their own apologetics at the Answers Research Journal or the Journal of Creation or anything like that, or the heavy guns, or one of their occasionally technical posts at Creation Magazine and the like, we'll see whether or not Heidner Hare is ever discussed about any of these papers, let alone taking the data in those papers and making any sense out of it in terms of their young Earth creationism. Oh, folks, and I trade my cold snap for your heat snap, please. Yes. Well, I would say no. Spokane actually is in a little better spot. We've had kind of a whiplash of temperatures, but nothing nearly as disastrous. If you look on the maps, you've got this absolutely insane bulge of the jet stream that is pushed all the way down into Colorado and Arizona and all that. So it's pumping cool air, but causing thunderstorms and crap around the periphery. And so it's getting, for a while, some kind of cool air and occasional little light sprinkles. So we've been oscillating back and forth in roughly the 70s or so here. Now we're starting to push back into the 80s, and it's starting to dry out. But nothing at all like the roast your balls off temperatures that people in Texas and other places have. And Texas, of course, has their power grid stretched to the max. They were going to go it alone and not worry about connecting up. Ironically, sunny days in the Texas means sunny days are helping their electric grid insofar as solar power is able to cut some of the slack on here. So anyway, it's quite peripheral and oddly relatively inconsequential cosmology and astrophysics. Yeah. This was on my mind, this cosmological matter, because one of the big chapters that I'm doing for the new book is on the whole cosmological scheme, the creationist dislike of the Big Bang, their arguments about how the planets formed and how meteorites formed, and whether there's an Oort cloud, and whether there's any... well, they've had to kind of give up on the idea that there aren't any planetary systems. If you look at old creationist apologetics, back when I was a whippersnapper, a creationist could easily say the Earth is the only planet in the universe, and there wouldn't be any direct evidence to say to the contrary. Now, boy, we're not the only planet in the universe. So the question is, are we the only planet with life in the universe? And odds are it's going to be hard to find one, but that will be close enough to be able to observe even with the Webb telescope. Although I must say the Webb telescope is actually designed to look into the infrared, and so it's basically looking for the heat signatures of very early stars that have passed into the infrared because they're so far away. The redshift has pulled them out to where to observe them. You've got to use a telescope designed to do that. So it's not really, the Hubble still is handier for looking at some of the closer in stuff. Yes. Oh yeah. Yes, there is a colossal difference between AiG and ICR functionally, and CMI basically do the same thing, that they have a doctrinal purity test. And regular scientists, no, nobody's making that operation in the regular scientific community. And so if you have a religious faith that in your heart of hearts you think all of this is the tapestry of creation done by whatever creator you happen to like, fine and dandy. But there's no mandate that you do or do not think that in terms of doing sound science. And that's why even the full out creationists are able to do within the niche okay scientific materials, but inevitably they're in the stage where in order for them to kind of articulate their doctrinal position, they are not going to be able to make it pass muster in a regular secular science journal. So but in some cases you find that even in their own creationist literature it gets kind of wonky. Andrew Snelling does long papers where he is talking about the little rocks and stuff that he found when he did his little expedition that got everybody incensed down there in the Grand Canyon. And he's going through like some Victorian antiquarian, just marking out the numbers and the forms of the various little crystals he's doing. But he's not really making any sense about whether or not any of this is actually helping his argument at all. So it's a fascinating little mess. Yes, yeah, the close up, because a lot of it is just bright, and two, it's not designed to look at certain kinds of things in certain wavelengths and certain focal points. But I would say that compared to where things were when I was a whippersnapper, this is just astonishing. No, all the understanding that there are planets around other star systems, including Alpha Centauri, which is our nearest neighbor, was something that I was suspecting would be utterly impossible to learn within my lifetime. Well, wow. How that changed. Even I would say as late as, well, I mean, really in the 60s and 70s. And I mean, it's been quite recent that we finally built telescopes with such incredible resolution power that we've been able to resolve these things and explore them, either through occultation experiments and of course, gravitational lensing and other means of looking at things that are relating to black holes and all that sort of stuff. And that, so it's an immensely exciting time for everybody but creationists, because they've got to figure out, as this continually expanding data field, like those 3 new papers, that theoretically that would have to be accounted for. So everybody, especially if there's any astronomer-minded folk watching the show, keep track on that stuff and see whether or not any dust settles and whether the creationists ever do any follow-up on it from their point of view, other than just kind of going, well, they're just using an evolutionary assumption and I don't have to think about it much. So, so there's been an astonishing amount in all fields whatsoever. I was old enough to have lived through the transition in the plate tectonic fields, where when I was in high school era, continental drift would be regarded as a really weird idea that had a problem because no one could figure out what mechanism would make it work. And then in the 60s and 70s, the evidence of seafloor spreading became obvious. And like you flipped a light switch and geology said, oh, well, there's the mechanism, boing, and moved on. Another great revolution that was taking place in that period, not merely the discovery of DNA, but figuring out how the codon system works. And that went on for about 30 years of working out more and more details and starting finally to do genetic analyses where you could actually have the complete genome of individual organisms. And we still don't have a huge amount of that. And better yet, multiple examples of a genome, not just the human genome, lots of humans that you could look at the whole genome of. Oh yeah, well there. Then you, Purple, will also remember that time frame quite well. But anyway, the big revolution in the biological end has been way more recent, all roughly as recent as two other things that were happening in this period. The Hubble Space Telescope stuff on the one end, and also the paleontological revolution on the discovery of feathered theropods. That has just been, woo, that started blowing up exponentially from the 1990s on. But at the same period in the 1990s is when they really started getting serious about homeobox genes. And then the other element, when you finally started getting complete genomes, was the realization that you didn't have a model of where one protein is coded by one gene. Nope. Multiple proteins are coded by genes with splicing and reading them backwards and all this kind of weird stuff that reminded us of how intricate the genetic system is and how it is very clunky weird, and how that sort of stuff can go on in so many different ways, of where something that is a component of an already existing gene can take on a completely new attribute as it gets co-opted and spliced out, and a new protein and things develop from it. So you could argue, oh, well, it's all originally designed, except it wasn't all originally designed, not in any original organism from the Precambrian. It is a weird thing to think about that. And another area that's just spectacular in terms of the cutting edge is the use of LIDAR and the like to do archaeology. So that probably we have learned more about ancient cultures and lost cities, some of which are buried in the desert, but visible from space through remote sensing, or through little units flying around with drones and all that, or covered over with jungle, as in the case of so many of the Mesoamerican cultures, but which are visible, and therefore you can go to that location and start dealing with the digging without actually having to tear out all the trees. And so that level of the new technology is absolutely spectacular. And of course, it's also being used for remote sensing for ecological purposes and all the rest. You get the same disconnect with the climate science denialists, who don't seem to be up to speed about how the material is changing in time. All that I've heard about the pyramid was that there have been a, not quite a LIDAR thing, but it's, I'm not sure what kind of scanning resonance thing they were using with, and they would have an interior detector and set a thing off, and whoop. So it's in a way a counterpart of how you could tell the material inside of the earth by the acoustic waves going through when you have an earthquake going on. That there may be some void up above where the king chamber is. Whether that's an actual chamber, there doesn't seem to be any way to get into it. It's not like in the same way that there's a whole bunch of relieving chambers directly on top of the king's chamber. So there may very well have been spacers and stuff where they figured out ways to kind of empty things out so it wouldn't require quite as much stone because of all of that bloody weight pressing down on what's below. And remember that by the time you get to the Cheops pyramid, you've got examples of several earlier pyramids that had collapses, failures, stones cracking from the various weight or the mass of stones that they didn't put them in at the right angle. They had them a little too steep, and whoop, the whole side of the pyramid falls in. So that's why one of the ones in the predecessors to Cheops there, one of them had 3 pyramids that were built during his reign, because the first couple, one of them ended up the famous bent pyramid, which apparently they decided just to truncate it to cut the mass down because the previous one had collapsed. And then that looked kind of ugly. And so I think he built a third one that is shallower and smaller just to get over it. When you were a divine god king, you could get away with these things. Plus, they apparently lived long enough that they had time enough to do all of that stuff. It looks like it took about 30 or 40 years to throw up something as big as the Great Pyramid. And it is the most complex and quirky of them because it was either things that went through design changes as to where the chambers were going to go as it went up. since nobody kept records of the details of how all this, we don't have the history of the building of the Great Pyramid according to Khufu, to be able to tell one way or the other. It's all inferential. And so we don't know how much of the interior layout of the Great Pyramid was intentional from the start, or how much of it was ad hoc, adjusting and changing stuff around as they felt like doing stuff. Oh yeah. Well, there's in its own quirky way, there was a guy, Tompkins, different spelling than Jeffrey Tompkins, who wrote a entertaining but wacky study of the Great Pyramid, kind of from the mystic point of view, beautifully illustrated, and it was a wonderful and fairly accurate recounting of all of the various wackaloon beliefs that had accumulated over the years on it. But the guy who wrote the book also had a soft spot for some of the, not razor blade sharpening or anything, involving space aliens, but nevertheless the idea that there could be some mysterious cosmic significance to why the thing was built the way it was. This Polish guy said the Earth goes around the sun. Yeah, well, that's that newfangled stuff. Who you're going to do? He didn't publish in a peer-reviewed journal. Not that there were any peer-reviewed journals back in 1300. But nevertheless, gave it a whack. So anyway, that's a weirdly divergent whoop, whoop, whoop around the core of things. One of the things that I've been doing now that I've gotten to the much improved internet is that I can now also catch up on following up on source material. And while I'm doing that, also dragging in and coordinating my spreadsheet analysis to take into account how many PDFs and things I've got, which I hadn't done before. And so I'm gradually burrowing my way through. I have a long list of pending files of stuff that may have been put in my reference bibliography, but I didn't print them out for a hard copy to allocate them to particular topic areas, so there's no annotations or anything on them. And that kind of stuff, you can lose track of where things are. So anyway, I'm trying to keep track of all of that while in the process of organizing all the material for the new book. And hopefully then this will make it a bit easier for burrowing through subsequent book projects, because I'll have a better sense about what material I have in my files already, as opposed to the stuff that I have hard copies of on books that I have in my personal library, on all of that. Because I probably have more books now in PDF format than I have physical hard copy, and I've got shelves and shelves of that in my back bedroom anyway. Shilling for the Illuminati. Yeah. Yes, the Illuminati. Well, you have to remember the Illuminati have had to change over to low wattage LCD lights, LED lights, in order to save energy. And so it's a little bit different than the old days, when you had like a gas lamp that looked really neat and made a nice hissing sound for the Illuminati. But now, they had less fun with the electric and all of that. But you can always rub two Boy Scouts together to make a flash. And so if you want, then the Illuminati method can come about from that mode. So that does. Does your reference section of your book need its own book? Yes. I sometimes fear about that, The reference bibliography for the section that I've done already, although it'll be shrunk down just like we did the one in Roxford there, is like a couple hundred pages long already. Because boy, that stuff on the mythology and the claims about living dinosaurs and the material on the dating of Genesis and all of the stuff that's going to be related to claims about Darwinian racism and all of that, it piles up. And in particular, this chapter has a lot of the history, because there's been an enormous amount of revisionism in the creationism movement over the years on, were they racists? Oh, yeah, but they don't want to make that impression now, so they just tidy it up and sweep it under the rug in relation to Henry Morris. And so Dwayne Gish wasn't so overt about it, but an awful lot of those old 1960s creationists came from the South, and they were marinated in that framework. Write each book. What happens if one of your sources is proven wrong before you're finished? Very good question. Although there weren't any examples of it in the second book, or the first volume of the book, or for that matter, in Evolution Slam Dunk. I'm always mindful of exactly that issue: is there something that will cause the revision of something? There are a few cases that we keep track of that and took some notice of in the first book about some of the people who are notable figures in the evolutionary community, like Francisco Ayala and others who got in trouble in the Me Too era over sexual harassment. And we alluded to that to some extent. May very well be alluding to Mark Hauser's instance in the Human Evolution chapter, because Hauser shot his foot off and lost his, metaphorically, his career as a consequence of bullying grad students regarding their observations of primates in his work. And so that would be examples of ones. And there are other examples of occasional scientists who get into trouble in things for sexual harassment lately. And so in my reference bibliography, I've made a point of highlighting their names in color so that it'll remind me. Occasionally, there's like a climate scientist that has had a connection. I think it's Wiki or something. I think it started with a W, W or an M, something like that shape. Anyway, he was a real prick, apparently. And so he was finally hauled up on these charges. And I would immediately go through and find out how often he was popping up as a co-author in some of these papers and making a little notation of it. If you have a huge block of scientists and one jerk is in them, it doesn't necessarily in any sense invalidate the work, just as Mark Hauser's involvement in some of these things don't necessarily do. Will there be too big a book, The War and Peace? Well, I have to tell you, Rocks 2 cannot be bigger than Rocks 1. That was at the outer edge of the size of a book that you could print at Amazon, literally. When I finished the bloody thing, I had to shrink down the footnote size, or the index and the bibliography font, and shrink things down to bring it below the limit of what they would print. So it can't be any bigger than this, kids. And so I'm very mindful of the prospect that the chapters and stuff that we come up with will see how it works. I do not relish the prospect of having to split it up to a volume 2 part 1 and a volume 2 part 2. I don't know. We'll see what happens on it. But there is always the prospect that the typeface size of the reference bibliography could get really tiny in the second book. We'll find out on that. I suspect seriously that the book that Jackson and I intend to do on the evolution and origin and nature of religion will very possibly be a 3-volume operation. I have a huge amount of material on that, and he's going to be putting in his own perspective on things, and we want to be comprehensive in dealing with other than just the God of Abraham set. We leave no turn unstoned, as the saying goes on there. Plus all of the social implications, and in that there's a direct issue about to really dive into the notion of what is the nature of consciousness, what is the nature of language, how is our language related to the development of music, how is our religion connected to the things that make us sports addicts and political extremists, and there's a whole bunch of stuff going on, and an interesting amount of direct cognitive work that's being done that's just tiptoeing into that field over the last 15 or 20 years that bears on that subject, which, by the way, creation has paid virtually no attention to. Yes, you just did that to have the record for the biggest book ever published on Amazon. It was not my intent. When I realized how big the structure was going, and we were nearing up the end we were getting to the middle of the book, and I was telling Jackson, this thing's big. I think we got to split it in half. And he agreed. And then I even as it is, for those who have Rocks for Their Volume 1, there's technically a goof in the geology chapter because it still has Tales of the Big Slosh as the chapter title, but not in the table of contents. And that's when it was going to be part of all that mythological material was going to be part of that, the other half of that chapter on the geological stuff. And now that it was split apart and I had to pull stuff, I even made a goof of, there's one little source citation that was in the second book or the first book that actually will be ending up in the second book that got in there. And an eagle-eye person shows you people do look at the footnotes and look at the references. Bless you. That's what you're supposed to do. Don't take our word for it. Follow up. Obviously, they can't teach a horse how to construct an epistemological framework. Yeah. Well, that one is an interesting scholarly issue, which is, I think Ken Ham doesn't pay attention to much. I mean, Ham directly will make statements that are reflecting of his old 1980s brand of creationism, oblivious to what's in his own museum and Ark Encounter. He blithely dumps on the horse evolution issue when the Ark Encounter has a Dinohippus as the ancestral horse. And casually, I think he's totally unaware of what plate tectonics work and stuff has been done by it hasn't been done by creationists, but I mean plate tectonics that's been incorporated into the Creation Museum, where they have Rodinia being the pre-flood continent and Pangaea, the one that occurs somewhere lickety-split after the flood-ish. They're not entirely clear on this point. And so people at the Ken Ham preacher level are really not paying a hell of a lot of attention to stuff. Now, when you move over to the techno geeks, there it's an interesting scholarly issue as to how aware a Tim Clary or an Andrew Snelling, I can't imagine that they're not pouring through these technical works from their rival creationists. Once in a while, they'll get incensed enough that they got to weigh in on the subject, which is why you had, I think, Jason Lyle was dumping on Guglielmo over at ICR over the fact that he has abandoned natural selection. And, although Lyle's a physicist, so, he's not exactly the right person to quibble on this point. And every once in a while, you get little fistfights going over where the flood boundary is and all that. But that leaves us then to the pull in the gangplanks approach of where the groups like to be in-house. So ICR would prefer to basically cite ICR, and AiG would prefer to cite stuff in-house AiG, and CMI would like to do their little niche. And so there's a compartmentalization that goes on, which can accelerate the process of them not paying attention to their other material unless it gets into a fist fight. So it's going to be kind of fun to see about. Yes, Erica does it, and Joel Duff is aware of these kinds of things as well. He's been the one that dubbed the phrase new creationists to refer to your Kurt Wises and that crowd that are getting dumped on by a cadre at ICR for being apostates, or at AiG for being apostates, that jihad that Ken Ham's bunch are dealing with, which basically deals with, I can never remember the bloody guy's name. Sorry, he calls it with an S, but it's probably a pseudonym. And I think Dan Stern Cardinale sussed out who he probably is, and we're alluding to it in a note in the new book. Creation of Civil War will be bigger than the Avenger 1. Well, except it will be special effects on the level of a made-for-TV movie in 1980. Although, to be fair, yeah, I mean, if you look at some of the Genesis apologetic stuff, they're able to do some fairly sophisticated visual material. If you look at the graphics in this Sarfati book, they've got very nice. It looks just like you would get from a real live, normal adult, properly printed book. And it's really looks artsy and visual. There, if you look at the average issue of Acts and Facts, it's all glossy and high quality graphics and the like. They've got that down. What they don't have down is the content. So that's the way that's kind of going to be on that. So anyway, I think that brings us up to speed on the material as to what's going on. And the same special effects company of Night at the Ark Encounter. Oh yeah, yes. For those who are unaware of that, there was a hilarious thing, and I think was Eric Hovind involved in that, or was one? I seem to think it may have been him. But this, they were obviously parodying or trying to riff off of Night at the Museum comedies, and instead to slip their creationist material. I'll give them points for trying to be clever. Unfortunately, it wasn't terribly clever. And of course, light comedy is probably about the best that Eric might be able to go for. Although, don't give up the day job. And does Eric actually have a day job other than being part of their creationist apologetic things? I don't know what their filings are in terms of what kind of income and stuff they get in on it. And presumably from donations and the sales of their product, like books like the one that I bought and all that, which is kind of why I try to avoid having to shell out money as much as possible on these things. But once in a while, you find some things that, from a scholarly methods point of view, I want to pin down because it's a way of measuring the progress of their field. So I can give you a sense about what's going to be going on as we move in the weeks to come into this little puppy, is that I want to know how much of it's new, how much of it's just retread of earlier apologetics. It's a brand new book out, so clearly they could theoretically be up to speed on an awful lot of issues. And so to find out what they do and do not discuss, how old some of their material is, and how in-house they are, how many of the time, how much might they not be able to resist trolling stuff in relation to, say, the intelligent design movement? Although, to be fair, dinosaurs in prehistoric life, what are they going to find in the intelligent design movement to be much of a fun part of it? They've avoided all of this. So really, your young Earth creationists are about the only ones who really dive into the Mesozoic, as we'll see. And I think they allude peripherally to mammals and the mammal-like reptiles and a few other little things like that. So I think it's going to be funky to see that there is no general reference listing in the book. There are footnotes at the end of each chapter, and in that respect, it's mimicking Pandas and People, which is an annoyingly frustrating book. I hate works like that have their little footnotes at the end of the chapters, but you have no master reference list to find out what hell is listed in there or not. At least Steve Meyer, in his tendentious 500-page tomes, has a reference bibliography, and Michael Denton has in his 2016 book. In fact, all of the ones that he's done, which makes it a little easier to be able to burrow through to find out what they've cited and what they haven't. And you could spot then, assuming, of course, they've been accurate in putting everything in and all that. And in the larger book you get to, one of the things I might do in future is to compare the two Steve Meyer books, the one on the design in the cell and the other one, Darwin's Doubt. They're both about 500-page books, and they both got about the same amount, maybe 800-ish sources per book. But how many of those are overlap between the two? I don't know, because I've not done a source analysis on them. I would be willing to suspect that maybe most of it is fresh material in between the two books. But then once you go through that, then you can start diving in on what they're leaving out in relation to particular topics. And then finally, the big elephant in the room, what the hell their model is, which no intelligent designer has ever pressed to. So anyway, Eric's day job is being a mini-me wannabe. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Although he's been very careful to latch on to a better quality of creationist apologetics. He's not quite as extremist in terms of the wackaloon stuff that Daddy Kent would trawl online. How many sources are Trojan horses? Yeah, the one. Well, if by Trojan horse you mean a stealthily brought in creationist source, or a source that actually is not arguing the point that they're trying to make and they're slipping it in just to make it look good. I would contend that that kind of category is the predominant stuff that I'm observing in that Jeanson book, the traced book. But as to the slip in stuff, he does a little bit of that as well, because he avoids bringing in a lot of the creationist material until kind of along the side and then in the appendices. Most are somewhat just not actually represented. Most debunk themselves. That's why from a scholarly methods point of view, creationism is a never-ending buffet of indigestible glop. That it can be tedious if you have a mind that glazes over going through the footnotes of something. That can impede you. I've always had kind of an anal retentive geek quality that I can plow through that kind of stuff to see. I'm the sort that will go through 2 lists of something and cross-reference to see who's on what list and who's on the other. In fact, that's something eventually I'll have to do with the Discovery Institute list of there's 1,100, I think, at the moment, scientists who are skeptical of Darwin. And of course, there are occasional examples of people who signed it without realizing that they were on something that was an anti-evolution thing, and that wasn't their position, wanted to have their names removed, et cetera, et cetera. But it's been iterated over the years. And what intrigued me about it was that as you looked at the newer versions, they were always presented as a PDF, and they aren't in alphabetical order. So how exactly is it that you can find out who's been added? Well, you would think it would be the new names on the back, so that you would look at the reference the PDF of the old version and go to the end, and then you would see the new names. But apparently that's not what they did. They have sprinkled names somewhere in the mix to do this. And so I've always been intrigued to find out just what exactly from the 2008 to 2009 to 2011, who gets added and where they get snuck in. That alphabetization issue is another thing that frosts my balls, and you don't want to think too much about that. In relation to why the names of the kinds in the arc encounter are in the order that they are. By definition, kinds can never turn into another kind. So although you wonder, why are they grouping mammals together and reptiles together and dinosaurs together? Why? That's kind of a systematic issue. Curious. But within the mammals, why aren't they in alphabetical order? No kind can be related to any other kind. So why would you not put them in an easy way alphabetically? Well, it's because the sources they've cribbed were evolutionists. And the lists are ripped off from the regular systematic issues. So groups that are related by evolution at the family level, supposedly separate kinds, are being put in the list in the order that they are, like on Wikipedia. Ha! And that is a really fascinating thing. So in the new book, there will be the listing of the kinds that, so everyone can see the bloody thing, because they literally don't have a list of their kinds in a format that you can actually see at Answers in Genesis. A picture that's blurry that you can't tell anything about. So it took several different people taking pictures, one of which included Erica, to be able to finally ferret out what the master listing, what's on that damn chart. Well, I wish that were true, that they hadn't passed kindergarten. But in fact, having a PhD and going at the collegiate level and being a postgrad is not their problem. It's the fact that they are Tartucan minds who don't think about things they don't think about, and have an apologetic imperative where when push comes to shove, they can just mangle a reference so that it fits the thing and lie about it. Or they're so bloody blockheaded that they don't see that they're manipulating the source. we've got too many examples of that popping up between, well, from the Duane Gish era. I alluded to quite a lot of that in Evolution Slam Dunk, where I only found out the level of his manipulation when I could see the original source material. And that's why I'm so keen on being able to see the primary sources, because if you're just looking at the abstract of a paper or just the gloss of a book, you will never be able to investigate it properly. You've got to get the full text of the original material and then find out, oh, that's where they got that from. Ooh, they left that part out. Ignorant kind, the dumb kind, and stupid kind. Well, I wish, again, that were true, in fact, the most hilarious or peculiar of creationists are, in fact, extremely bright people. They're competent in their own venues. They've gone through the educational hoops. And so they must imagine that they cannot possibly be mistaken about something. There's an arrogance, a hubris about them. An example from the intelligent design movement is the late Philip Jeanson. Jeanson was an accomplished law professor at Berkeley and had a painful divorce and got religion, and then got on the intelligent design bandwagon and largely moved that along, connecting up with Steve Meyer and all the various people that then linked up with the Discovery Institute, and away we go. But the thing is that no one in any stretch of the imagination could call Jeanson stupid. He got into Harvard when he was 16. This clearly was not dull as a sack of hammers mind. And yet, when it came to how he would suck up information from secondary sources that met his expectations, exactly the same kind of mistake that a Kent Hovind is doing at a much more superficial, childlike level, then you have to wonder why someone like a Philip Jeanson, who should know better from a scholarly point of view, could behave so rudimentarily and manipulatively at the Kent Hovind level at the drop of a hat. And that's why I started to develop that whole Tortugan model of the mind, where things are just bouncing off the mind shell and they're grasping at secondary sources. Perfectly fine example of Jeanson and secondary sources is when he openly stated in Darwin on Trial that the writer who got him to be doubtful about human evolution fossils was Malcolm Bowden, the English creationist. Now, Jeanson was certainly aware that he was a creationist. He openly acknowledged that. But mercy's sakes, Bowden is a geocentrist. He doubts the earth revolves around the sun to this day. And either Jeanson didn't know about it or didn't care. But I would put it to you that somebody who is able to rearrange the data field to make you think that the earth doesn't revolve around the sun is probably doing the same thing when they're talking about Pekin Man and Java Man. You're seeing exactly that same phenomenon, that they can be exceedingly accomplished in their area of expertise, and that may make them feel that they are invulnerable to being wrong. And the thing is you can have very narrow Tortugan ruts. If you look at a young Earth creationist, they have a vast, deep Grand Canyon, all-embracing Tortugan rut, because the entire worldview changes the perspective of everything. In some respects, you have to have an all-embracing deep rut for flat earthers, because it forces them to think that astronauts haven't been to the moon and a whole bunch of things. There's a bunch of fallout on it. Whereas somebody can be a very narrow structure. You could be an anti-vaxxer and politically liberal. Robert Kennedy Jr. is an example of somebody who comes from the democratic framework of things and would be, in many respects, falling in that left wing of the Democratic Party. And yet, boom, he's a flaming COVID vax denier and thinks that Mercury autism connection. Jackson Week did just a recent video on that very point. And I reminded him, keep all that information handy, because the book we're planning on doing on the conspiracy thinking mindset, that's part of the subject matter. So it's a fascinating window. I would contend lack of lateral thinking skills. Yeah, that's part of it, I think. You've got a good point there. That for me, the creationist is the perfect field of analysis because it reflects the mindset of what's going on that you can see manifesting in various other areas, and including ones way outside of creationism. So I would put it to you that a doctrinal Marxist-Leninist denying that the Ukrainian Holocaust took the big famine took place during the 1930s. When you start analyzing their secondary churning of Soviet propaganda and the like, they're doing exactly the same thing methodologically as Holocaust deniers and anti-vaxxers and flat earthers and people who think everybody but Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare's plays, or everybody but Lee Harvey Oswald was involved in the Kennedy assassination, and on that, even though they may be reflecting different elements of these things. And talented people pop up. There's the writer at the end of their career syndrome that pops up. 3 different names pop up in my head. One is Tom Wolfe, who got on the anti-evolution bandwagon late in life before he died. Michael Crichton, who got on the climate denialism bandwagon late in life. And one that you may not be aware of, Earl Stanley Gardner, the creator of Perry Mason, who got in the Ica stone Aracambo figures thing towards the tail end of his life. He bought into that stuff. And let's mention Arthur Conan Doyle, who believed in the fairy folk and spiritualism in the 1920s and all of that. And so otherwise very bright minds. Oh, and for that matter, Alfred Wallace had his little streak. He was an anti-vaxxer, although it was a little more justified given the rudimentary nature of vaccination in the 1880s, but also kind of had a soft spot for phrenology, and was a spiritualist. His sister got him involved in that. So you get, and at one time he even took up smoking because he thought it would help his asthma. Somebody had recommended that to him. So, okay, no, I don't. Breathing problems that he had. I don't think it was directly asthma. History of the famine that I have no idea why Ukraine doesn't want to be on. Yes, indeed. Who would think that the Ukrainians might have a sense of bad relations with Mother Russia? Yeah, exactly so. And I think it's, well, the Russians, of course, have an enormous incentive to try to get Ukraine back because, as the old saying goes, Russia with Ukraine is an empire. Without it, it's just a little third world country. And so we'll see what the heck goes on there in the next few years. We live in exciting times, don't we? Well, anyway, we actually burbled on into practically an hour for Evolution Hour. Let me see if I can cue up my little doodad here. Let's get my little video going. I'll close that off. Boop, boop, boop. Always takes me a few seconds here to do the doing. I need, there we go, get my video up here. And then it automatically starts. And I have to stop the bloody thing and then get back over to here and do this. And it's all with this stupid, okie doke. Oh, whoops. Wrong screen. Window. There we go. Share. Okay. And let's see if this works. There it is. Dear old Peter, he does some nice little graphic works on that. If you haven't bought The Rocks Were There, and for that matter, Evolution Slam Dunk, and for that matter, if you like fiction and they got a summer reading time, there's the 2 novels. There's links to all the books in every video. I'm anal retentive about making sure the shameless plugs are all there. And I'm proud of all the works. I think they're fun stuff. See you all next week. Cheery bye, everyone, as they would say in England. It's kept me busy in my retirement, doing all the books, and keeps my mind agile and fun. I met so many fascinating people, both coming up to it and not. So The Rocks Were There. Get that, kids. And See you all next week, except no wooden penguins. Although, if a poor little penguin is outside because of a heat wave and they need to come in, fine. But if they're wooden, make sure you keep it away from things they should be kept away from. Just a word of warning. Okay. See you all.